Welcome to the Down Dog Athletics Podcast, a competitor's guide to mental health and mastery, your resource for conversations around mental health and the mindsets necessary to master every area of your life. My name is Paul Klingen, and I'm a former Division I athlete that struggled with my mental health until I started yoga, which opened me up to other practices that gave me a balanced approach to my physical and mental health. The goal of this podcast is to inspire others to do the same, train and compete like an athlete, while also having the ability to slow down and practice stillness. When you can do both, you find balance and evolve into a greater version of yourself. What's up, everyone? Welcome to the Down Dog Athletics Podcast, Competitor's Guide to Mental Health and Mastery. My name is Paul, and man, it is a good time to be a sports fan. If you listened to the last episode with Chris Hippa, you know that we got the finals coming up with the Lakers and the Heat. Seahawks are popping off. Russell Wilson's an MVP. Bryson DeChambeau just won the U.S. Open. Everything's like playoffs are about to start for baseball. NHL Stanley Cups going on or just finished, and it's a good time. It's a good time. Obviously, also a crazy time politically. Hope you guys are doing okay there. This is definitely not a political podcast, so I'm not going to go that route. But big thing, I think, is to always focus on what is good. There's always good. There's always bad in every situation. And as a sports fan, I'm trying to focus on what is going good. And, you know, we even got some college football that's going to start for you UW and Wazoo fans. So good stuff. Before I get into today's guest, be sure and check out some of the free programs that we got over at downdogathletics.com. You can either go to the website and you'll see the free programs there, 30 days of coaching for free. You can just download an individual workout program. We got yoga, HIIT, or training, or literally from just your phone right now, you can just text DDA30 22828, and you'll get a little text to you so that you can sign up and get that sent right to your email for free workout program. Try to create a ton of free content for you guys. So literally anything that you need, I've got it for you. And if you don't find something that you need, let me know, and maybe that's something that I can work on creating with my team. So to get to today's guest, Kirsten McCormick is someone in the Seattle community. She's a trainer, nutrition coach, and really a mobility specialist, someone that I really respect in the community, does a lot of FRC, functional range conditioning, for anyone that's not familiar with that, kin stretch, and just a really good, well-rounded wellness coach. She's been in the industry for a really long time. And I just went over to her house a couple weeks ago, and we just had a really good conversation and talked a lot of training philosophy, a lot of where the industry's moving and where a lot of people can really benefit from now. We're all inside, all struggling with mental health or bad posture, maybe not going to the gym as much. And she's just got a lot of really cool practical tips. She's one of the sweetest people I've ever met, one of the smartest people I know in the industry. And I'm just really excited to have her on the podcast and let her share her story of how she got to where she is. And maybe if you follow her already, you'll learn a little bit more about her. But you'll definitely learn a lot more from a health and wellness standpoint. So here we go. Let's get into today's podcast. Next part I want to dive into is just really where you got into the fitness industry. And I know we've talked a lot about your introduction with yoga and how that's kind of morphed into what you do now. But where were you like when you first started getting into coaching? I know you got a background in sports, so maybe touch on that a little bit, but what kind of really got you into this space?
Well, the truth of where I got into this space. I goes back to high school. I lost my dad when I was a senior in high school. And at that point in my life, I didn't really know where I was going to go or didn't have a direction. And some friends were going to Ithaca College, and I was like, okay, that's a good spot for me to apply. My parents didn't really educate me on colleges necessarily, like of where I should go or why I should go to college and what I should study. And so a couple friends were going to Ithaca, and I applied, got in, and I was a good student in high school and college. But my choice to go there was purely for from a friend's perspective. Needed people in my corner because I lost a big part of my life. And one of my friends was going into exercise science, and I was like, okay, maybe I'll take some science classes. That sounds good. And again, I was an athlete, and so I was playing lacrosse at the same time, and then I started taking these anatomy and physiology classes, enjoyed it, which I hated science in high school, so it's an interesting, switch. And just fully decided to change. I had an exploratory major, and this one friend kind of steered me in that direction, and then I had a clinical exercise science degree, and then I one of my teachers kind of pulled me in as a mentor and had me work at the facility that was the training facility for the faculty. And then, yeah, that was kind of like the start of what led me in that on that path. And then I would say the biggest part of like my learning experience with training was I moved to LA right after college, and got a job at Equinox, which was a great lucky first job because they're like one of the top in the industry, and worked my way up pretty quickly within that company. Stayed with them for 8 years, and I don't know if you're familiar with Equinox. I'm sure you are, but they are really great at educating their coaches. And someone mentored me when I first got my job there, teaching me how to program design, and yeah, Equinox brings in like the top of the top wellness educators, and yeah, that I would say they were like my big start with training and education and continuing to educate myself along the way.
Yeah, that's super interesting. So you're playing lacrosse in college, and then where's Ithaca? I want to say it's New York.
Upstate New York.
Okay,
Yep.
cool.
Yeah.
My geography's not terrible. Did you find that the lacrosse, like your lacrosse and your athleticism benefited by knowing more about the body? That's always something that I'm curious about. If I would have known what I know now when I was playing college baseball, if I would have taken nutrition seriously. Or like I remember taking entire summers off training because I was just like, I don't need to. I'm a natural athlete. That's what people have told me all through high school. And so I'm curious on what that was like actually learning about something that was related to what you're doing.
To be honest, when I was playing sports and taking the classes, I don't know if I really applied it to myself at that time at such a young age. Like it was like, I'm learning about the body, cool. But
young and dumb.
I was learning as much as I could, but not necessarily applying it. Now it's like completely different. Now the things that I learn, I try to apply and explore, and same thing like throughout my career. But at that time, I don't think I did.
Yeah. Now we're like mad scientists where we read one thing in a book or go to one course, and all of a sudden we're like throwing a bunch of different props at us to try and figure out like, how does this feel? Where do we move to? How do we cue it and all that stuff? That's super interesting. And how did you like working at the start in a structured gym? Because I started without that structure. I just kind of knew what I had from sports. I knew really what I had from a personal training certification, and then just kind of like figured it out along the way. What do you feel like was really beneficial being in, because you talked about program design and having a mentor. Now that you've kind of done stuff on your own, what did you appreciate about having that as your background, and maybe miss now being on your own a little bit more?
Oh gosh, so much. That's such a great question. I think the when I started at Equinox, having this one person, his name is Mark Myers. He pulled me under his wing, and in school, like we learn about anatomy and physiology, we learn about biomechanics, but we don't learn how to program design. At least when I was in school, which was early 2000s. And so he, pulled me under his wing and taught me how he programmed designed and what to think about. And I think then within Equinox, like you're working with this team of trainers and this team of coaches. And I, within my first year, moved up within the company. So I got to Tier 4, which they now call Tier X. And we were the only club on the West Coast. It was before Equinox like exploded to the number of clubs they have now. And you work with coaches, and you're all working together for the same client. So a client might see me on Monday, someone else on Wednesday, someone else on Friday. So you're having to interact with these coaches, and you're learning from them. They're learning from you. You're kind of sharing all of your insight and input onto this one client or multiple clients. So that was super beneficial. Like you're not only learning from the educators that they're bringing in, but you're learning from the coaches around you. And I think you can still get that in gyms today that aren't doing that like shared client experience. But it's different, I think. And I think that was like so important for me, learning from others. And then also like that being in a club and at the start of my career, like it taught me uniform. Like, I mean, I wear black all the time, and I've had I've had people say like, why don't you wear some color? And
It's
it's
a
like,
great aesthetic.
this
Don't change it.
is my uniform.
Yeah.
Like I only wear black. Unfortunately, it's carried over into the rest of my life as well. But so I don't wear black there, or I don't wear color there as well. But uniform, like timeliness, like all of these things that I feel like if I were on my own, I wouldn't have learned necessarily.
Yeah.
And then today, like being on my own, I miss that group dynamic of having other coaches in your corner and like learning from them constantly. So I do continually do education. Like I'm currently enrolled in another certification right now with the Institute of Motion. And that's great because you can get feedback from other coaches and you're learning from them and they're learning from you. But that's something that I miss. I mean, right now, especially during COVID,
Yeah.
this is my office right here in
Yeah,
my living
we're
room.
sitting in your office
Yeah.
right now on a nice big rug that honestly is like kind of a nice yoga mat if you could lay on it.
Yeah.
I think the big thing is just like the structure and routine.
Mhm.
And even if you're not in the fitness space, like not having the structure and routine and going into the office and collaborating, like I think people took that for granted. And
Mhm.
now we have that taken away from us and we realize, wow, it actually is really nice to be with people.
Mhm.
And, you know, it's nice that you had that because then you have that carryover of that structure and routine and that uniformity. I'm guessing you're talking about uniformity too, even in just like systems and program design,
Yeah.
where you're able to learn that and carry that over, which is
Mhm.
super cool. And definitely something that as an athlete, you and I both, you understand how valuable that team aspect is. And, you know, there's always going to be an element of doing things on your own and being able to like grow fast. But one of my favorite sayings is the wolf travels fast, the pack travels far.
Mhm.
And so there's always going to be an element of both, but I definitely think that that's a super interesting insight. Was that a time for you when you were diving a lot into like strength training or aesthetics focused, or when did you make that transition into more mobility? Or we've talked about yoga a lot, and so maybe talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I feel like I've transitioned a lot throughout my life. So early on in my career, I was like super focused on strength. Like I lifted a ton of heavy shit all the time. I also boxed. I only wanted to do hard things. A client of mine was a yoga teacher at the time. This was in my early 20s, and he kept trying to convince me to come to his class. And I was like, oh my gosh, I don't want to go to yoga class. It's like a waste of my time.
Yeah.
And I went to one class, I gave it a try, and I was like, oh my gosh, this is so boring. I can't do it. I didn't feel like I got anything out of it. And it wasn't the time in my life like that I was ready for it. I wasn't open to it.
Yeah.
And then fast forward a couple years later, I, went through something in my life, went through a big breakup. I was like, okay, maybe I just need to like chill my mind out for a second. And I decided to go to a yoga class, and it was my second yoga class ever. Went into class, did the thing, and it like pushed me really hard. It felt great. And I think I needed that. Like I needed a hard class. And she approached me after class and was like, I think you should like really get into yoga. And so she brought me to her teacher. And then that just that I laid down at the end of class and cried and had a moment with yoga. And that then I started going once a week. Then I started going 3 times a week. And then I got to a point that I stopped training, strength training. And then I was doing yoga 7 days a week. A little too much.
Yeah.
Didn't find the balance there. I've learned it as I've gone along. So then I was practicing yoga at 7 days a week, went and got my yoga certification, became a teacher, and then I started getting injured. So I had stopped strength training, only doing yoga. I'm a hyper flexible person. That's not what my body needs. I was pushing into it. And then I started to sprinkle strength training back in, realizing that I needed it, started to pull back a little bit from yoga. And then fast forward a couple more years, like found mobility training with FRC, other things along the way too. But FRC really changed the way I thought about all movement and training. So I still do yoga. I approach it very different. I still strength train. I approach it very different. I do mobility training, approach that different. Like what I thought mobility training was and what I think a lot of people still think mobility training is just stretching, flexibility, like extending your extensibility of your muscles. And I So I'm trying to find the balance of all three of them. Currently, during COVID, to be honest, have not been doing anything, hence an injury.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's interesting that you talk about the seasonality of it, because I feel like I had a similar season where for probably like a year I was doing a ton of yoga, like 5 times a week, plus I
Mm-hmm.
was strength training, but I was like, I dove into that so much.
Mm-hmm.
And since then have taken things that are really valuable from it. A lot of like the mental benefits, the breathing benefits, and then like don't get me wrong, like I still will do like maybe one or two. I did a bunch more when I was doing the marathon training, but then I just kind of hit this wall. It was after teacher training where they made us take 60 classes in 2 months
Mm-hmm.
as part of the 200 hours. I was like, that was a lot, and just kind of like peeled back, and then went into back into like strength training and did that until I got hit by a car.
Mm-hmm.
And then I was like, oh man, I need like more mobility and like relaxing. And it's like there's never going to be like a constant, what's the word I'm looking for? Like constant perfect dose, effective dose of the two. And that you talk about the time of your life. I've had several people on this podcast who were like, I went to yoga, it wasn't the right time. I came back at a second time, and it came at the right time,
Mm-hmm.
just to where I was in my life. And it was a hard class, so the body is a bridge to the mind and the spirit.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's one of the things that is really cool about yoga is it allows you to connect those two, where a lot of other practices are so like sympathetic and just like like
Mm-hmm.
fast and hard that you don't get that like slowness and stillness and reflection time that is really valuable
Mm-hmm.
and that I found really valuable.
Yeah.
And I find that the three things that you talked about are the three things that I'm trying to explore. And I feel like you got to also got to do due diligence. You can't kind of half-ass like 33% all three to get
Mm-hmm.
enough to know and be able to teach it and coach it.
Yeah. You have to dive in.
Yeah.
Like, the only reason I learned so much about yoga is because I dove in like 110%. And then I learned to pull back. And now I don't need the hard classes. Now I don't want the hard classes. But like, I feel like anything that you do, like training, mobility, yoga, whatever it is, like in order to like truly understand like the depth of it all, you have to go in and, whether it's for a season or whatever, like you have to
Yeah.
dive in.
Like for me right now, I'm tracking macros and I've done it for months, like
Mm-hmm.
on and off. Don't really like it. And I've said I hate it because it's structure and I love being spontaneous and I love just kind of like going with the flow and letting my body be natural, which is what I've been able to get away with for most of my life. But it's like, I want to dive into this so that I have that depth
Mm-hmm.
to be able to understand, like, one, how hard it is. Because I think another thing that I appreciate about you and other good coaches is you've experienced it. I never want to ask someone to do something that I've never done myself
Mm-hmm.
for either an extended period of time or at a really high level. And so recently I ran a marathon and it was like I wanted to be able to understand what someone was going through mentally and physically.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not going to be a run coach. I don't want to be a run coach, but I want to at least be able to speak that language,
Yeah.
which I find is super cool, fun,
Mm-hmm.
and important.
Yeah. I was amazed at watching that journey of yours through social media.
So you recently had an ankle injury running.
Mm-hmm.
Your handle is running with forks, but you were talking about being more into cycling. What happened with the injury? And I think it'll be an interesting segue and kind of the mobility aspect that you're diving into and have into a lot recently, and like how important that is because
Mm-hmm.
there's a spectrum to a degree of stability, flexibility. Yoga can create hypermobility where you don't want that,
Mm-hmm.
but then you can also get so stiff that you can't even move, and you
Yeah.
don't want that either.
I first need to say that the name of my company, Running with Forks, the only reason that I have that name is because I had a personal chef company alongside my training business when I was in LA, and that was the name of my chef company.
That's
And when I
funny.
moved to Seattle 6 years ago, I that was my LLC. I had it, and everything is under that umbrella. I hate that name.
So you're a chef then, or quite a cook, or
You
to a
used to
degree.
be, yeah, used to be.
We'll have to get into that season shortly
Yeah.
too.
Anyway, now I'm forgetting the question. I got very hung up on running.
You were running a little bit this in quarantine, and just kind of like what you've learned with that.
Yeah. So, for me, I am not a runner, and I'm not a runner. I used to be. I used to be a runner. I should say that. I used to run a ton when I lived in Los Angeles. And I am not a runner because of the things that I have done to my body over the course of my life. And I know that there are ways that I could fix this one issue with my body, along with many others. I have I'm hyper flexible in general. The yoga doing that 7 days a week was not beneficial to my body, hence needing the strength training and needing that like variability in my training, which I think variability is super important for everyone. Structured variability, not chaos, not like
Yeah.
chaos training. But for me, and I know I'm like bouncing around on my thoughts, but I need like strength training for my joints. I also like mentally need the mindfulness of yoga and that side of things. And then the mobility training, that's super important because it's working on the control of your ranges of motion. And clearly I dislocated my ankle because I do not have control. One part of that is because there just are no structural ligaments in there holding it in place. But two, like people think about mobility as this extensibility of our tissue, and we need to have the control to control our joints through range of motion. But when you're limited in what structures you have internally, like in your joint, that might not be possible. So mobility training where you're like training at end ranges of motion isn't necessarily the only thing that I need, because I need more like full range of motion. Like, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like with the end range training, like that's just end range. But when you have these injuries that are like high impact, high force, they're at high velocity, you're not getting that in mobility training. Some coaches are doing like high speed mobility work with end range training with athletes, but it's not common. And for me, I need to be taking my body, like what will prevent those injuries from happening for me is like being strong in the mid ranges even. And I know I'm like bouncing around,
No, it
getting
makes
lost
sense
on the
because
question, but
injuries a lot of times will happen at the end range of a joint, and to a degree, you might be able to be strong at 5 pounds, 10 pounds, or whatever force is being applied, but it's that eccentric component that a lot of people get injured in, thinking of like a knee or an ankle, you're landing, right? You didn't injure it expressing force off the ground. It was coming into the ground. And that's where I feel like mobility training is so important, because it increases your ability to continue to be strong, strong, strong as that ankle rolls in or rolls out, 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 out. And
yeah, at every
there's
degree.
always going to be a degree to when the body can't handle that, right? You
Mm-hmm.
can't just jump off a building and have really mobile joints that will save you. But I feel like that's something that a lot of people miss. They're like, "Oh, I'm flexible, I'm strong," but those, as much as I said earlier that it's kind of a spectrum, there's
Mm-hmm.
also like a third dimension to that.
Mm-hmm.
If you're thinking of like a cube versus square.
Yeah. And like with yogis and like so many yoga teachers now are becoming more and more aware of like the differences between active and passive range of motion, which is great. Um, but a lot of people still are just seeking that range of motion, that extensibility, and if they're not careful and if they're not also balancing that with strength training, not just mobility training, but strength, then injuries will happen at some point.
Yeah. When you're doing mobility training, I'm curious on your thoughts on the degree to which, like, obviously you want to create tension. It depends on like how stiff things are. One of the things I found really interesting from Dr. Spino was talking about is how flexibility is a neurological
Mm-hmm.
issue, basically, where it's like the muscle spindles, the communication that's happening from the tendons is like, yo, homie, this is not happening. We need to stop, because the brain's having that communication.
Mm-hmm.
And so I found it really interesting on just how the breath is, in a way, like very shallow and fast, and like probably sympathetic most of the time, depending on what you're doing. But then you also have to have that element of the body understanding, like, it's okay. Does that
Mm-hmm.
make sense? Do you kind of
Like
understand where
when you're doing the mobility training, like you're creating tension, so your breath isn't
you're
like this
creating tension,
calm
so you're
breath.
this like spaz and we know that like spazzed muscles or people who are freaked out are the least likely to relinquish control and like expand.
Well, I think so. The central nervous system is like extremely complex. Um, when you're doing your mobility training, you are creating tension, but you are at the same time, because you're doing it slow and controlled and you're pushing for your end ranges, I feel like your nervous system does respond in a way. Obviously, it will improve over time. Like if you are like someone who's just like stuck in a sympathetic state constantly, just mentally, which then in turn relates to your tissues, that it your tissues will still be stuck until you like work through that over a period of time. That could be depending on your how much overload you're giving your tissues. Could be a short time, could be years. But I think your nervous system is still responding in a positive way because it's slow and controlled, as you're like, if you think about a shoulder cars, right? And that's just maintenance. That's not necessarily like extending your range of motion. That's just maintaining what you currently have. That engagement and control as you go through is signaling to the nervous system in a way that's going to elicit a positive change.
Yeah.
But then like you have people who, they're feeling like super tight in their hip flexors and they just want to stretch it. But that is, again, the nervous system creating tension because maybe there's a lack of control and stability there, not that they have tight hip flexors.
Totally. Another thing that I found really interesting in the training was just how the communication or the language that cells speak is force. And so when you're looking at mobility training, you're basically applying force to the different tissues and then they're adapting to that. And then there's the if you don't use it, you lose it concept. And I feel like so many people now are working from home where there's a whole lot of losing it happening. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah. Neuroplasticity. So that's like the use it or lose it, like in whatever feedback you consistently give your body, it will adapt to that. But like people are just sitting and they're like sitting and then your hips are just getting dehydrated because of this compression into those joints, and then they're dehydrated, so then there's not this like fluid being able to be pushed around the blood, the lymph, the interstitial fluid, like it just gets.
So you're saying dehydrated in the form of like the blood
tissue
flowing in the
tissue.
Okay,
Yeah, not like they're not drinking water, but like
I know, but now I'm picturing my hip flexors as a like nice beef jerky that might sell well. Yeah. We'll save it for after I'd pass, but that's interesting. I didn't realize. I mean, it makes sense that you'd cut off circulation. But yeah, I'd never heard the word dehydrated used in that, but that's cool.
And just like, I mean, if you're sitting at home, like just the more you can get up and move your body, and mobility training, like I know we get, and I am FRC certified and I know you are as well. And like when we think, I think as FRC mobility specialists, like you then get stuck on all mobility is FRC. I don't believe that all mobility is FRC. Like, I think there are so many ways to like express force into your body and into your tissues. That's not just cars and pails rails.
Yeah.
Like, you can do lots of movements where you are, as long as you're creating tension and you're creating directionality of like where you're moving, like even if it's just, getting some sort of spinal rotation with a split stance side bend or something like that, like your intention behind it can still be mobility, not just stretching into tissue.
Yeah, one of the things I loved was just ENG, so eccentric neural grooving, which is kind of coming back to like the injury prevention thing that I was talking about with the mobility, but I love applying that in my training because in a form it is mobility training, it's helping with flexibility, but you're able to do it with weights, or you're able to do it in more maybe movement patterns that you're more familiar with. So when I get someone or even myself, it's like, oh, my quads are a little tight. It's like, yeah, you want to stretch them. You want to definitely like make sure the hips are working as hips should work. But then you can also really kind of try and slow down your lunges, your squats, and get some benefits from there as well.
I think like this is reminding me of a lot of the course that I'm currently doing, and it's all about creating structured variability in with everything: training, mobility, cardio, your power, your regeneration, and your recovery. And something that this particular governing body, Institute of Motion, talks about is maybe you've heard of it, but like their whole model is like the 4Q model. And so if you think about like traditional, and this is where traditional strength training, like what you think of as traditional strength training, kind of falls short. Like with traditional training, like you've got your squats, your deadlifts, your pushes, your pulls, like everything, even if you're doing like lateral lunges and stuff in the frontal plane, it's still very linear. And so they have something called linear training and movement training. And then both of those, like making sure you've got loaded linear training. So working in those, the standard planes of motion that we think of as coaches, and then unloaded. So body weight stuff, or, just loaded and unloaded. And then same thing for movement training. Movement is like creating that structured variability for movements that you would find in everyday life, both loaded and unloaded. So like if you're sitting on the couch and then you want to reach over and grab something off the floor, like how do we train that in our training program with clients? Like what sort of movements can we start to incorporate in where they're actually preparing their body for that mechanical stress that's in their everyday life? So that's something that's super...
Which is really interesting too, because there's very few times in life, and I think of like sports, right? Everyone gets big into squatting, and then unless your lineman that is like expressing force bilaterally, like into the other lineman, very rarely are your legs like perfectly even and you're going just straight forward, up and down. And so in a way, movement patterns can definitely be really rigid. And I think that that's something that I'm learning and working on, as well as thinking, and I'll even think about it when I'm like picking stuff up, and it's like everyone says, oh, you want it to be functional, like lift it like a deadlift. But it's like, honestly, there's some times where like I'm going to just move and pick something up. And yeah, you want your body to be in the right position.
But there is no right position.
Exactly. And that was another thing.
There
is
is
like,
no right posture.
There is every, even if you're doing an overhead shoulder press, every single expression of that is different to some degree. It's never like 0, 0, 0, 0. It's like 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, 0, 0, 2, 4. And there's that variability, I feel like, is something that's cool that you bring that up, because it's something that we need to account for a lot more. Like even like we're all static, so there's zero variability. And then maybe we exercise, and then there's some variability. But that makes me feel like we should all just go dance.
Totally. Yeah. I have a client that I've been working with for a few years. Love him to pieces. But he is someone who has been injured over the course of his life, and from hearing things along the way that you have to squat this way, you have to pick things up off the floor this way. It is so hard to sell him that he can move in other ways. Like even when I have him like pick up a kettlebell off the floor, I see him like, I mean, obviously I teach him to pick things up properly, but then everything is so methodical and has to be so perfect. I'm like, okay, relax. He's also someone that's like very stuck in the sympathetic state constantly. So trying to get him to like relax his body is hard, but it's funny because he will want to do everything so perfect. And when I throw an exercise in there that is having him like do something dynamic, where, I mean, he does a lot of dynamic movements, but dynamic in this non-traditional way where he's totally rotating his spine and flexing at the hips at the same time, it can be scary for some people.
Yeah.
So it's teaching them how to be okay with that and know that they won't get injured.
Do you find that clients like that are that rigid, like how you do one thing is how you do everything? So is he also like putting his books like perfectly stacked and making sure is that the case with him and maybe like other people you see?
Yeah. And to get him to lay down and do breath work is really hard, but like he sees the benefits like over time, but it takes a while to sell one thing. And I think there's a lot of people out there that it takes a while to sell that movement is variable, and to add that structured variability so you can prepare your body is it's
Yeah.
gonna be hard for some people.
It's like there's like this pendulum that keeps swinging, and you'll get people that are just like all about weight training, and then they'll see something that's like, you'll see it on like sponsored ads all the time, where it's like, grab this random piece of equipment and then just like move like a ninja. I think WEC method. I don't know if you've seen
I
any
don't
of
know if
that.
I have seen
It's basically a mace, right?
Okay.
We've
Yeah.
all seen
Yeah.
maces from On It, and they're basically like doing that and hammering stuff away, and they're like, this is revolutionary. And I think with like fitness, nothing's revolutionary. The body's been the body for so long, but you'll get people in one camp who are so like, well, when we were hunters and gatherers 200,000, or I don't know how many years ago, 2,000 years ago, and we were living in caves, well, our circadian rhythm was this, and then we would be fighting a saber-toothed tiger, and then this and this and this. And I'm like, I see validity in that, but then there's also the other side of the coin where it's like, we aren't chased by saber-toothed tigers, and it's like there has to be this like middle ground that's really hard to find. And I find the hardest thing to do as a coach is find out where someone is on this spectrum of like rigidity, structure, maybe super stress, and then someone's like super fluid and just like a fairy in
Yeah.
like their personality. And it's like, okay, it's going to be really hard to get you over to the other side, but like that's the battle. And so in
Yeah.
that, when I say that, it's anyone listening, like if you ever hear that this is like the one way or the best way, that is the best way. I'm like contradicting myself, but like that's the best way to know that like you should not listen to that. Anyone
Yeah.
who says I'm a big Star Wars fan, so I love the saying, only the Sith deal in absolutes. So anytime you get someone in the fitness industry who's like, this is absolutely the only way, that's how you know they're a bad person.
Well, yeah. Some people are very stuck on their ways. Doesn't necessarily mean they're a bad person, but
That's fair.
I
I was just trying to align
yeah.
it with the Sith and
Yeah.
Darth Vader.
Um,
No one's Darth Vader, by the way.
No one's Darth Vader.
No, just him.
What was I was just gonna say something. I had it before, but then I got lost on
We're
your
talking
Darth
about,
Vader.
I know, we were talking about spectrum and trying to get people
Oh,
from
I
one
know what I
side
was
to the
gonna say.
other.
You just have to meet everyone where they're at. Like,
Yeah.
just your fairies that you were talking about, or the wherever they are wherever they are at on the spectrum. You meet them where they're at, and you just try to incorporate as many different modalities in as you can. And some will stick, some won't. Some will work, some won't. Every day is different. Every person's different.
Well, for someone like you, so you're big into cycling, and I want to dive into that and like some of the things you like about that, and some of the maybe things you got to emphasize for cyclists when you're working with them, because it is such a linear pattern, right? So what are some of the things that like you're working towards that allow you to be a better cyclist? And then what are some of the things that you also got to make sure and be careful about to mix up their training?
Well, to be a better cyclist, you just need to cycle more, really.
So it's just all volume. That's what my running coach would say. He's like, you want
just
to be a
gotta
better
run
runner?
more.
Like, go run more. Like,
Yeah.
oh, that makes sense.
Yeah. Specificity.
Yeah.
So I just need to be biking more. And I don't think I bike enough. But strength training, being able to pedal hard and push hard, cardiovascular training, like doing your strength training with that endurance component, that power component, just incorporating everything in. And then, yes, everything is so linear and in the sagittal plane when you're on the bike. So like getting into all those different planes of motion, doing the more loaded movement training as well. Like anything that you do for your body to strengthen it in every different position is important. Like, I mean, if you were to fall off your bike, right? Like I mountain bike. I am also someone who, my husband calls me Cautious Carl because I do not want to fall ever. So I don't really fall. But if I were to fall,
I would call that like logical Linda. Like, I don't want to fall ever, especially in the mountains on a bike.
Yes. So, but if you were to fall, then if your tissues are prepared to handle stress in every plane of motion, every range of motion, then you'll be stronger overall and mitigate injury. So lessen the risk a little bit. But
Yeah, totally. Well, everyone and their mother now is inside, and Peloton's obviously soared, so there's a lot of people cycling. There were already a lot of people cycling, but I feel like even for people who aren't maybe biking like competitively or mountain biking, there's still a lot of just general population that are on bikes. So what are some of the things that they should be conscious of? I always tell them, like, you can't just ride your Peloton 6 days a week and expect anything to change other than like really sweating through a lot
Yeah.
of clothes.
I mean, moving your body, like think about the position that you're in when you're on a bike. Your like hips are in flexion, your knees are in flexion, your spine is in flexion. So balancing that out, like, I mean, yoga would be great. Like getting onto your mat in your living room in a yoga class where you're extending the spine, just moving in opposition from your positions that you're spending most of your time in. And especially like if you're sitting at home on your computer all day and then hopping on your Peloton, like
Oh,
you're
that's a
in the
double
same,
whammy.
yeah, you need different movement. Um, but then on the bike, like I've actually noticed I've had quite a few people get Pelotons in the last few months, and some people started experiencing more low back pain because of the position of the hips, but also like paying attention to how your legs are aligned while you're cycling. If you have tight hips, most likely your knees are going to be splaying out away from the top tube or center bar
Yeah.
of the bike, which is going to further have those hips engage and then cause more pulling up into the hips and the QL and onto the lumbar spine. So squeezing in, strengthening your adductors, like your inner thighs, so that you can maintain that alignment and balance out that hip imbalance.
Is it a strengthening of the adductors, but also like the ability to go into deep flexion? Because I feel like that would also be
Yeah.
a
I
limiting
mean,
factor too.
again, this just goes back to variability.
Yeah.
Like spending time doing mobility work, spending time doing strength training, spending time like in the oppositional positions that you're in on the bike or
I've actually had a few, I think women, this is something I just heard one time, so correct me if I'm wrong. I probably am wrong. But women naturally have a little bit more lordosis in their low back, so like a little bit more arch. And I've had a few male clients who would do like Soul Cycle and they do those tap backs. And to get into that position, you're basically like tucking your pelvis forward like over and over and over, where I don't know. This
yeah,
again, like
I
I'm
think
just
it's
like
such a
throwing this
funny
route.
thing that I mean, I'm not hating on Soul Cycle, but all these cycling facilities that do these, upper body workouts while on a bike. And I know people are just trying to get more bang for their buck out of a class, but I just think it's really funny.
Yeah. Well, that's why I was thinking about it because you're trying to have like good posture and then you also now have to be aware of your posture as you're like sliding forward at this
Yeah.
45-degree angle. And then the biggest thing that I'll see with push-up form is I call it like the Soul Cycle push-up where the elbows are like
Mm-hmm.
almost higher than the ears.
Mm-hmm.
And so I'm like, all right, so we don't want super wide, 180 degrees. We don't want like necessarily like always a yoga chaturanga tricep push-up basically. So like let's find a happy medium. But I feel like those push-ups on those bikes are even exacerbating a little bit more what we naturally do, which is like traps lit on fire, ears talking to our shoulders.
Yeah.
And so anyone listening that is cycling, keep cycling. I'm pumped that you're moving, but just be a little bit more mindful of like the position that you're putting yourself in
Yeah.
beyond just biking.
Yeah. I usually tell my clients that have Peloton, save your push-ups for your strength training day. Don't do them on the bike. Your teacher on your Peloton Peloton's going to be like
Yeah.
coming after me now.
This podcast is sponsored by Peloton. Use our discount code for 20% more on your Peloton because rates have now gone up if you're listening to this. Oh man. What are you looking forward to like in the next? I know there's maybe less things to look forward to, but someone like you're working on a new course and always continuing to learn. What are some of the things that you're working towards and maybe excited for the rest of the year? Work-wise, life-wise. You got a dog, maybe
yeah.
getting another dog. Who knows?
Not getting another dog. Love little Mary Kate. I'm going hunting.
Are you a hunter?
This will be my first hunt.
What are you hunting?
Antelope.
So, where at?
Montana.
Wow.
Yeah.
So I'm watching Yellowstone right now.
Oh,
Have you heard of that?
Yeah, I've heard of it.
So you got to watch it before you go
Yeah.
because it'll like, again, belt buckle, like you'll feel like a real cowgirl.
My husband's from Montana, and so he used to hunt, and so we're going with his dad. This is just a funny story that I love to tell people. When he hunted as a child, his mom dressed him before they went hunting, and his dad said that he just heard whoosh, 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 and his mom dressed him in a snowsuit
Oh my
to
gosh.
go hunting,
That's so funny.
where you're supposed to be quiet and yeah. Anyway, totally sidetracked. But when I think of hunting, I think of that story. But
Well, now you got to make sure
yeah,
that you're like all decked out. You
all
got your
decked out.
outfit. Are you actually going to be hunting yourself, or are you just like
Yes,
going along with them?
I will be hunting.
Okay, cool. So you've gone to the range and practice shooting
In the past,
in the
I
past.
need to go, and I've got to do my hunter safety
Are you doing
here.
bow? Or are you doing like do you know the
Rifle.
specific rifle?
No, shotgun. I don't know. This is bad.
I don't
I'm
know. I'm using a spear. We're going back to the caveman days,
I'm not
and we're
going
gonna.
bow hunting. I am using a gun.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's exciting. That's something I've not dove into at all. Like either 3 weekends ago, I was fishing with my uncle, and he asked me to bait the hook, and I was like, "You bet." Like people are good at certain things, they're less good at certain things. Outdoor is definitely something I have room for improvement on, but I do think it is interesting and would be fun, and there's so much to learn about that.
And that's kind of like why I'm doing it. Like as someone who used to be a chef for people, and I also eat meat. I eat everything, but the fact that I eat meat and haven't hunted or experienced what that means, like for eating another animal, I feel like that's important for me to, have that deeper understanding.
Yeah,
So
totally.
that's primarily why I'm doing it.
Yeah.
And I might sound a little silly not knowing what gun I'm going to be using,
No,
but the meaning
the
behind it for me
questions that
is
I'm asking are even sillier. I'm like, are you bow hunting? Are you
that's the
are
thing.
you chasing it with
Yeah.
with a spear? Like, who
Well,
knows?
antelope are very fast.
Yeah, they
So,
are definitely. I have this theory that like animals like antelope or smaller mammals that are always kind of just like spazzing out looking for bears and lions, they're like very sympathetic. Whereas you look at big animals like bears and elephants and rhinos are
mhm.
just like chill. And I don't
Mhm.
know if they either evolved to be bigger because they're very parasympathetic, and just like looking at how you look at people who are very like squirrely, always sympathetic and can't put weight on. And then you look at these like big like ho hum, yet they're just like massive naturally.
Mhm.
I have this theory. Anyway, I'll do that research when I get my PhD in biology.
Yeah.
We're all right. I'm literally making stuff up. So you're going hunting. Where can people find you to connect with you on social media, website, and anything else?
Running with Forks is my website and my social media handle. Yeah. One day that name will be changed.
To
Promise.
what?
I don't know. Maybe just my name. But
There's
Running with Forks has got to go at some point.
I love that. All right, cool. Well, thanks for inviting me into your home and taking time to come on the podcast.
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Yep. All right, before I let you go, just want to say thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you got something out of it, be sure and tag Kristen and I. Remember, she's at running_with_forks, and I'm at Paul_Klingen on Instagram. You can shoot me an email if you have any questions about today's episode or really anything wellness related, Paul_Klingen. If I can't help you, I'll point you in the direction of someone that can. And also, if you get something out of the podcast, share with a friend, leave a 5-star rating and review, subscribe, help me grow the podcast. I really appreciate it. We got an awesome guest coming next week. If you guys have followed, what's that show? It's on Bravo, Summer House. If you guys followed The Honey House, this guy is all over social media. He's over in New York, and you guys will recognize him, one of the most powerful motivational speakers that I've met and that I know, and he's going to continue to blow up. So super excited for next week's guest. Be sure and tune in. Otherwise, I'll catch you guys next time on the Down Dog Athletics Podcast.